Marcus Sullivan had been dead to the world for 10 years. That's what his military file said anyway. Missing in action, presumed dead after a covert operation in the mountains of Afghanistan went sideways. His Delta Force team had been ambushed, scattered, and when the dust settled, Marcus was nowhere to be found. The official report listed him as another casualty of war, another name on a memorial wall that his younger brother Jake visited every Veterans Day. Jake Sullivan had built his entire identity around being the brother of a war hero. He'd parlayed that story into a successful career as a military contractor, landing lucrative government contracts by leveraging his family's sacrifice. He'd married Sarah, Marcus's former fiancée, 6 months after the memorial service. He'd even moved into the family home their parents left behind, displaying Marcus's medals and commendations like trophies in his office. The insurance money from Marcus's death had funded Jake's company, Sullivan Defense Solutions, which now employed over 200 people and generated millions in revenue annually. What Jake didn't know was that Marcus had survived that ambush. He'd spent 3 years as a prisoner in a Taliban compound, 2 more years recovering in a Pakistani hospital with severe injuries and amnesia, and the last 5 years slowly piecing his life back together. The military had written him off, his family had moved on, and Marcus had chosen to stay dead rather than disrupt the lives that had been built on his grave. He'd been working as a ranch hand in Montana, going by the name Mike Stevens, when he'd seen Jake on television. His brother was giving an interview about Sullivan Defense Solutions, standing in front of a wall covered with Marcus's photos and medals, talking about how his brother's sacrifice had inspired him to serve his country through private military contracts. The interviewer had asked about the family business, and Jake had smiled that same cocky smile Marcus remembered from their childhood, as he claimed their father had started the company before his death. That was the first lie. Their father had been a mechanic who'd never owned anything more than a wrench set. The second lie came when Jake described how he'd used his own military experience to build the company. Jake had been a supply clerk who'd never seen combat, never left the wire, never fired a shot in anger. The third lie was when he talked about honoring Marcus's memory by continuing their shared dream of building a defense company. Marcus had never dreamed of building a defense company. He dreamed of coming home to Sarah, buying a small farm, and raising children who would never know the sound of gunfire. He dreamed of teaching his kids to fish in the same creek where Jake had taught him. He dreamed of growing old with the woman he loved, watching sunsets from their front porch. Instead, he'd watched his brother steal his life, his woman, and his legacy while he was presumed dead in a shallow grave thousands of miles from home. Marcus had spent the last 6 months planning his return. He'd legally resurrected himself through a series of careful steps, working with military lawyers who specialized in cases of soldiers presumed dead. He documented his captivity, his injuries, and his recovery. He'd built an ironclad case for his identity and his rights to everything Jake had taken. Now he sat in his rented truck outside the Sullivan Defense Solutions headquarters, watching employees stream out at the end of another workday. The building was impressive, all glass and steel with his own photograph blown up to poster size in the lobby. Jake had even named the conference rooms after Marcus's military call signs. The audacity was breathtaking. Marcus checked his watch. 5:30 on a Friday evening. Jake would be in his office, probably on a call with some Pentagon contact, schmoozing his way into another contract. The security guard would be making his rounds, and Sarah would be at home preparing dinner for the husband who'd stolen her from a dead man. He'd spent 10 years learning patience in the worst possible circumstances. He could wait a little longer to reclaim his life. But first, he needed to gather intelligence. He needed to understand exactly how deep Jake's deception went, how many people were complicit in the lie, and what legal vulnerabilities existed in the empire built on his grave. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed the number for Sullivan Defense Solutions. When the receptionist answered, he asked to speak with Jake Sullivan about a potential contract opportunity. He gave his name as Mike Stevens and mentioned he was a former military contractor with experience in Afghanistan. The receptionist put him through immediately. Jake's voice came through the speaker with that same confident tone Marcus remembered, the one that had always hidden his brother's insecurities. "Mike Stevens, what can I do for you? I hear you're looking for experienced operators," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. "I've got 10 years of experience in theater, mostly sniper work. I'm interested in discussing opportunities." "Always looking for good men," Jake replied. "Why don't you come in Monday morning, say 9 o'clock? We can discuss your background and see if there's a fit." Marcus smiled for the first time in months. "I'll be there." He hung up and started his truck. Phase 1 was complete. He'd gotten an invitation into his brother's stolen kingdom. Now he needed to prepare for the conversation that would change everything. The Montana ranch where he'd been working had taught him more than just patience. It had taught him about justice, about the difference between revenge and accountability. The old rancher, Tom Morrison, had been a Vietnam veteran who'd recognized something broken in the quiet man who'd shown up looking for work. Over the years, Tom had shared his own stories of coming home from war, of finding his place in a world that had moved on without him. "Justice isn't about getting even," Tom had said one evening as they'd sat on the porch watching the sunset. "It's about setting things right. Sometimes that means punishment, sometimes it means forgiveness, but it always means truth." Marcus had carried those words with him as he'd planned his return. He didn't want revenge in the traditional sense. He wanted justice. He wanted the truth to come out, the lies to be exposed, and the people who'd been deceived to understand what had really happened. But he also wanted his life back. He wanted Sarah to know he was alive, wanted his parents' house returned to the family it actually belonged to, wanted his military record corrected, and wanted his brother to face consequences for the decade of deception. The drive back to his hotel gave him time to think about Monday's meeting. He'd need to be careful, to gather information without revealing his identity too early. Jake was many things, but he wasn't stupid. If he suspected who Mike Stevens really was, he'd have time to prepare, to cover his tracks, to spin the story in his favor. Marcus had learned a lot about patience during his captivity, but he'd also learned about timing. In the sniper world, everything came down to the perfect moment, the exact instant when all the variables aligned for a clean shot. He'd been waiting 10 years for this shot, and he wasn't going to waste it. He pulled into the hotel parking lot and sat in his truck for a moment, looking at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back at him was older, scarred, weathered by experiences that had broken stronger men. But he was still Marcus Sullivan, still the Delta Force operator who'd never missed a target, still the man who'd survived when everyone else had given up on him. Monday morning, he would walk into his brother's office and begin the process of reclaiming his identity. He would be patient, methodical, and thorough. He would gather evidence, document everything, and build a case that would withstand any legal challenge. And when the time was right, when all the pieces were in place, he would take the shot that would change everything. Marcus Sullivan was about to come back from the dead, and Jake Sullivan was about to learn that some ghosts don't rest easy in borrowed graves. The hotel room was sparse but clean, a temporary base of operations for a man who'd been living temporarily for 10 years. Marcus spread the files across the small desk, documents he'd gathered about Sullivan Defense Solutions, about Jake's life, about the contracts and connections that had built his empire. The company had grown rapidly, landing contracts with the Defense Department, Homeland Security, and various three-letter agencies. Jake had positioned himself as an expert in counterterrorism and special operations, drawing on his brother's actual experience while claiming it as his own. The client testimonials praised his deep understanding of combat operations, his strategic thinking, and his ability to deliver results in high-pressure situations. It was all built on Marcus's reputation, on missions Marcus had planned and executed, on skills Marcus had developed through years of training and combat. Jake had stolen not just a life, but a legacy, and he'd used it to build something Marcus barely recognized. The photographs in the files showed a man who'd grown comfortable in his deception. Jake had put on weight, dressed in expensive suits, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never had to earn his reputation. He'd been featured in defense industry magazines, spoken at conferences, and even testified before Congress about military contracting reform. Meanwhile, Marcus had been learning to walk again, to speak again, to remember who he was before the war had taken everything from him. He'd spent 3 years in captivity, 2 years in recovery, and 5 years rebuilding himself from the ground up. He'd worked construction, ranching, and security, always staying below the radar, always moving when someone started asking too many questions. The irony wasn't lost on him. While Jake had been playing soldier with someone else's medals, Marcus had been living the warrior's real journey, the one that didn't end with parades and interviews. He'd been learning to survive not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, in ways that no military training could prepare you for. His phone buzzed with a text message from Tom Morrison back in Montana. Heard you're heading back to settle some family business. Remember what we talked about. Justice, not revenge. Come back when you're ready to be at peace with whatever happens. Marcus smiled and typed back, "Roger that, old man, see you soon." He closed the files and looked out the window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Jake was probably having dinner with Sarah, living in the house that should have been Marcus's, sleeping in the bed that should have been his. Tomorrow was Saturday, then Sunday, then Monday morning would come and the real work would begin. But tonight, Marcus Sullivan was going to get a good night's sleep for the first time in 10 years. He was finally going home, even if home didn't know he was coming. Saturday morning brought rain to the city, a steady downpour that seemed appropriate for reconnaissance work. Marcus had learned long ago that bad weather was a sniper's friend, providing cover and keeping civilians indoors. He drove through the neighborhood where he'd grown up, past the elementary school where he and Jake had played on the same playground, past the high school where they'd both played football, past the church where their parents had been married and buried. The family home sat on a corner lot, a modest 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a big oak tree in the front yard. Marcus had climbed that tree as a boy, had carved his initials in the bark when he'd gotten his first military assignment. The initials were still there, weathered but visible, a ghost signature from a man the world thought was dead. The house looked different now. Jake had made improvements, added a deck, updated the landscaping, installed a security system. There was a BMW in the driveway, Sarah's car, and Marcus could see lights on in the kitchen window. His former fiancée was moving around inside, probably making breakfast, living the life that should have been theirs. Marcus sat in his truck for 20 minutes, watching the house where he'd been born, where he'd taken his first steps, where he'd said goodbye to his parents for the last time. Jake had claimed all of it, had moved his wife into Marcus's childhood bedroom, had probably thrown away the personal effects that hadn't been worth displaying as trophies. The rain stopped, and Marcus saw the front door open. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, and his breath caught in his throat. She was still beautiful, still the woman he'd fallen in love with in high school, but she looked older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. She was wearing a robe and slippers, and she stood on the porch for a long moment, looking out at the street as if she was waiting for something. Or someone. Marcus started his truck and drove away before she could see him. He wasn't ready for that conversation yet. He needed to deal with Jake first, needed to understand the full scope of what had been taken from him before he could begin the process of reclaiming it. The rest of the weekend passed in preparation. Marcus reviewed his military records, the ones that proved his identity and his service record. He studied the contracts Sullivan Defense Solutions had been awarded, looking for patterns, for connections, for vulnerabilities. He researched the key employees, the board members, the clients who'd been misled about the company's true origins. Most importantly, he prepared mentally for what was coming. He'd spent years in therapy, working through the trauma of captivity, of presumed death, of losing everything he'd ever cared about. He'd learned to manage his anger, to channel his frustration into productive action, to separate his desire for justice from his need for revenge. Sunday evening, he called Tom Morrison one last time. The old rancher answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "How you holding up, son?" "I'm ready," Marcus said. "Tomorrow I walk into his office and begin the process of taking back what's mine." "Remember what I taught you about patience," Tom said. "This isn't a mission you can complete in one day. It's going to take time, and it's going to be messy. People are going to get hurt, and not all of them will deserve it." "I know," Marcus replied, "but I can't stay dead forever. I have a right to my own life." "Yes, you do," Tom agreed. "Just make sure you're fighting for the right reasons. And Marcus, when this is all over, when you've set things right, make sure you're still the man you want to be." Marcus hung up and spent the rest of the evening cleaning his service weapon, a ritual that had always helped him focus before a mission. He wouldn't need the weapon for what was coming, but the familiar routine grounded him, reminded him of who he was and what he was capable of. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of weather that made everyone want to stay in bed. Marcus dressed carefully, choosing clothes that would make him look like a successful contractor without being too flashy. He checked his appearance in the mirror, satisfied that he looked like someone Jake would want to hire, someone who could bring value to Sullivan Defense Solutions. The drive to the office took 15 minutes through light traffic. Marcus parked across the street from the building, studying the security measures, the traffic patterns, the sight lines. Old habits died hard, and he automatically cataloged escape routes and defensive positions before catching himself. This wasn't a combat mission. This was a business meeting. He was Mike Stevens, a former military contractor looking for work. He was not Marcus Sullivan, the dead Delta Force operator who'd been betrayed by his own brother. At least not yet. Marcus checked his watch. 8:55, time to go to work. He walked across the street and through the front doors of Sullivan Defense Solutions, past the blown-up photograph of his own face, past the display case full of his own medals, past the plaque that read, "In memory of Marcus Sullivan, American hero." The receptionist, a young woman with a professional smile, looked up as he approached. "You must be Mike Stevens. Mr. Sullivan is expecting you." "That's right," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'm here for the 9 o'clock appointment." She led him through a hallway lined with photographs of military operations, weapons systems, and training exercises. Marcus recognized some of the photos, missions he'd participated in, operations he'd planned and executed. Jake had somehow acquired classified images and was displaying them like artwork in his corporate headquarters. The hallway opened into a large office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Behind a massive desk sat Jake Sullivan, older and softer than Marcus remembered, but still recognizably his little brother. The brother who'd followed him around as a child, who'd begged to be included in everything Marcus did, who'd always lived in his shadow. Jake stood and extended his hand with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mike Stevens, good to meet you. I'm Jake Sullivan, founder and CEO of Sullivan Defense Solutions." Marcus shook his brother's hand, looking directly into eyes that had once been as familiar as his own reflection. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Sullivan. I've heard a lot about your company." "All good things, I hope," Jake said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Please have a seat. Tell me about your background." Marcus settled into the chair and took a moment to look around the office. The walls were covered with military memorabilia, photographs, and awards. His own Bronze Star was mounted in a place of honor behind Jake's desk, along with his Purple Heart and his unit citations. A photograph of Echo Team, Marcus's last unit, sat on the desk facing outward so visitors could see it. "I spent 10 years in special operations," Marcus began, sticking to the truth as much as possible. "Most of that time was overseas, primarily in Afghanistan and Iraq. I did a lot of sniper work, reconnaissance, direct action missions. I've been out of the military for a few years now, working private contracts, but I'm looking for something more stable." Jake leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with an expression that was hard to read. 10 years is a long time in theater. What unit were you with?" "Various assignments," Marcus said carefully. A lot of it was classified, as I'm sure you understand, but I can tell you I worked with some of the best operators in the military. Delta Force, Navy SEALs, Rangers. I learned from the best. I'm sure you did, Jake said. You know, I lost my brother in Afghanistan. He was Delta Force, one of the best snipers in the Army. He died 10 years ago in a mission that went bad. Marcus kept his expression neutral, watching his brother's face for any sign of recognition. I'm sorry for your loss. It's a dangerous job and we all know the risks. He was everything to me, Jake continued, his voice taking on a practiced tone that Marcus realized he'd probably used hundreds of times. His sacrifice inspired me to start this company, to honor his memory by continuing to serve in whatever way I could. That's admirable, Marcus said. What was his name? Marcus Sullivan. He was my older brother, my hero. Everything I am today I owe to him. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he kept his face impassive. His brother was sitting 3 feet away from him, claiming to honor his memory while stealing his identity, his achievements, his entire life. Tell me about your experience, Jake said, changing the subject. What kind of contracts have you been working? Marcus spent the next 20 minutes outlining a carefully constructed background that was mostly true but gave away nothing about his real identity. He talked about security work, training contracts, consulting on tactical operations. He mentioned his sniper skills, his experience in urban warfare, his knowledge of counterterrorism tactics. Jake listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed more about his own knowledge, or lack thereof, than about Marcus's background. It became clear that Jake had learned enough military jargon to sound credible to civilians, but he didn't have the deep understanding that came from actual combat experience. I'm impressed, Jake said finally. Your background is exactly what we're looking for. We have several contracts coming up that would benefit from your expertise. Are you available to start immediately? I could be, Marcus said. What kind of work are we talking about? Jake leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. I'll be honest with you, Mike. We're bidding on a major contract with the Pentagon. It's a training program for special operations units, and we need someone with your background to lead the development and implementation. Marcus felt a cold anger building in his chest. His brother was going to use his expertise to train other soldiers, to pass off his knowledge and experience as Jake's own. The circle of deception was about to grow wider, to include more people who would be misled about the true source of their training. What would my role be? Marcus asked. Lead instructor and program developer. You'd be working directly with Army Special Operations Command, designing training scenarios based on real-world experience. The pay is excellent, and there's a lot of room for advancement. Sounds interesting, Marcus said. When do you need an answer? How about we discuss it over dinner? Jake suggested. My wife and I would love to have you over tonight. She's a great cook, and I think you'd enjoy meeting her. She's very supportive of the work we do here. The invitation was like a punch to the gut. Jake was inviting him to dinner with Sarah, to sit at the table in the house that should have been Marcus's, to eat a meal prepared by the woman who should have been his wife. That's very generous, Marcus said, fighting to keep his voice steady. I'd be honored. Jake smiled and wrote down the address of the house where Marcus had been born, where he'd grown up, where he'd said goodbye to his parents. 7 o'clock, casual dress. We'll have a chance to really talk about the position and what we can offer you. Marcus stood and shook Jake's hand again, memorizing the feel of his brother's grip, the way he looked when he was confident and in control. I'll see you tonight, Mr. Sullivan. Call me Jake, his brother said. I have a feeling we're going to be working together for a long time. Marcus left the office with his head spinning. The meeting had gone better than he'd hoped and worse than he'd feared. Jake had essentially offered him a job stealing his own expertise, and he'd been invited to dinner with the woman who'd been his fiancée. The situation was so surreal that he almost laughed. But the anger was building, a cold fury that he'd learned to control but never eliminate. His brother had stolen his life, his reputation, his woman, and his legacy. Now he was going to use Marcus's own skills to build his empire even further, to train soldiers who would never know they were learning from a dead man. Marcus drove back to his hotel and spent the afternoon preparing for the evening. He researched Sarah's life, what she'd done in the 10 years since his presumed death. She'd married Jake 6 months after the memorial service, had worked as a nurse for several years before quitting to support Jake's business. She'd never had children, which surprised Marcus since she'd always talked about wanting a family. He also researched the contracts Jake had been awarded, particularly the ones that required special operations expertise. The pattern was clear. Jake had been using Marcus's military record, his unit assignments, his mission experience to win contracts that required someone with his background. The clients thought they were getting a former Delta Force operator, but they were really getting a supply clerk who'd never left the wire. At 6:30, Marcus drove to the house where he'd been born. The street looked exactly as he remembered, middle-class suburban homes with small yards and attached garages. He parked in the driveway behind the BMW, next to a new pickup truck that probably belonged to Jake. The front door opened before he could knock. Sarah stood in the doorway, and Marcus felt his heart stop. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, but there was something in her eyes, a sadness that hadn't been there before. She was wearing a simple black dress and a smile that looked forced. You must be Mike Stevens, she said, extending her hand. I'm Sarah Sullivan. Jake's told me so much about you. Marcus shook her hand, feeling the wedding ring that should have been his, looking into eyes that had once looked at him with love and recognition. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Sullivan. Please call me Sarah. Come in, dinner's almost ready. She led him into the living room, and Marcus felt like he was walking through a museum of his own life. The furniture was different, but the room was the same, with the same hardwood floors he'd crawled on as a baby, the same windows he'd looked out of as a child. The mantel above the fireplace was covered with photographs of Jake and Sarah, but there were also pictures of Marcus in his military uniform, images from his childhood, family photos from before the war. Jake appeared from the kitchen, carrying a beer and wearing a casual shirt and jeans. He looked relaxed, comfortable, like a man who'd never had to worry about anything more serious than a quarterly earnings report. Mike, glad you could make it. Can I get you a drink? Beer would be great, Marcus said, settling into an armchair that had been his father's favorite. Jake disappeared into the kitchen, and Sarah sat on the couch across from Marcus. For a moment, they looked at each other in silence, and Marcus wondered if she saw something familiar in his face, if some part of her recognized the man she'd once loved. Jake tells me you're a veteran, she said finally. Thank you for your service. It was my honor, Marcus replied. Jake mentioned he lost his brother in Afghanistan. I'm sorry for your loss. Sarah's expression changed, becoming distant and sad. Marcus was. He was everything to Jake, to both of us, really. He was supposed to come home and we were going to be married. Instead, he died in some God-forsaken valley and we never even got his body back. Marcus felt his throat tighten. You were close to him. I was engaged to him, Sarah said quietly. We'd been together since high school. He was my first love, my only love, really. When he died, I thought my life was over. But you found Jake, Marcus said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. Jake found me, Sarah corrected. He helped me through the grief, helped me find a reason to keep going. We both loved Marcus and we found comfort in each other. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I had. Jake returned with the beer, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. They talked about the weather, about the business, about Marcus's fictional background as Mike Stevens. Sarah served dinner, pot roast with potatoes and carrots, a meal Marcus remembered from his childhood. As they ate, Marcus studied his brother and his former fiancée, trying to understand the relationship they'd built on his grave. Jake was attentive to Sarah, but there was something performative about it, as if he was playing a role rather than living authentically. Sarah smiled and participated in the conversation, but Marcus could see the sadness in her eyes, the sense that she was going through the motions of a life rather than truly living it. After dinner, Jake suggested they move to the living room for coffee. As Sarah cleared the dishes, Jake led Marcus to the couch and began talking about the business again, about the contracts they were pursuing, about the opportunities for expansion. "You know, Mike, you remind me of my brother," Jake said suddenly. "Not physically, but there's something about the way you carry yourself, the way you talk about military operations." Marcus had that same confidence, that same understanding of what it takes to succeed in combat. Marcus looked at his brother, at the man who'd stolen his life, and was now comparing him to himself. "I'm sure he was a remarkable soldier." "He was the best," Jake said with conviction. "Everything I know about military operations I learned from him. He taught me about leadership, about courage, about what it means to serve something bigger than yourself." The lies came so easily, so naturally, that Marcus wondered if Jake actually believed them. Had his brother convinced himself that the stolen life was really his own? Had he rationalized the deception so thoroughly that he'd forgotten where Marcus ended and Jake began? Sarah returned with coffee, and they spent another hour talking about safe subjects, avoiding the landmines of the past. Marcus learned that Sarah worked part-time at a local hospital, that she'd never pursued the nursing career she'd planned, that she spent most of her time supporting Jake's business. She seemed intelligent and capable, but there was a quality of resignation about her, as if she'd given up on her own dreams to support someone else's. At 10 o'clock, Marcus thanked them for dinner and prepared to leave. As he stood at the front door, Sarah touched his arm gently. "It was nice meeting you, Mike. I hope we'll see you again soon." "I'm sure you will," Marcus said, looking into her eyes and wishing he could tell her the truth. Jake walked him to his truck, and they stood in the driveway under the streetlight where Marcus had once learned to ride a bicycle. "So what do you think?" Jake asked. "Are you interested in joining the team?" Marcus looked at his brother, at the man who'd built an empire on his grave, who'd married his fiancée and lived in his house and worn his achievements like a costume. "I'm very interested. When do we start?" "How about tomorrow? We can go over the contract details, get you set up with an office, introduce you to the team. I think you're going to be a great addition to Sullivan Defense Solutions." They shook hands, and Marcus drove back to his hotel with his mind racing. The evening had been surreal, sitting in his childhood home with his brother and his former fiancée, eating dinner at the table where his family had shared thousands of meals. Sarah had been kind and welcoming, but he could see the sadness in her eyes, the sense that she was living a life that had been settled for rather than chosen. Jake had been confident and charming, but Marcus could see the insecurity underneath, the knowledge that his entire life was built on a lie. He'd seen it in the way Jake had watched him during dinner, looking for signs of recognition, for any indication that his secret might be discovered. Tomorrow, Marcus would begin working for his brother, using his own expertise to build Jake's empire even further. It would be the ultimate irony, the dead man training soldiers on behalf of the man who'd stolen his identity. But it would also be the perfect cover, the ideal position from which to gather evidence and plan his next move. Marcus Sullivan was about to become an employee of Sullivan Defense Solutions, and Jake Sullivan had no idea that he just hired his own replacement. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the Sullivan Defense Solutions headquarters at 8 o'clock sharp. He'd spent the night thinking about the evening, about Sarah's sad eyes and Jake's confident lies, about the life that had been built on his grave. He'd also been thinking about Tom Morrison's words about justice versus revenge, about the difference between setting things right and simply getting even. The receptionist, whose name tag read Jennifer, smiled as he approached the desk. "Good morning, Mr. Stevens. Mr. Sullivan is waiting for you in his office." Marcus made his way through the hallway of stolen memories, past the photographs of missions he'd planned and executed, past the display of medals he'd earned with blood and sacrifice. Jake was waiting for him with a stack of paperwork and a cup of coffee. "Mike, ready for your first day?" "Absolutely," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from Jake's desk. "What's the plan?" Jake spread out a series of documents on the desk. "First, we need to get you officially on the payroll. HR will handle the paperwork, but I wanted to go over the contract details with you personally. The Pentagon job is worth $12 million over 3 years, and your role will be crucial to our success." Marcus reviewed the contract, noting the scope of work, the timeline, and the performance metrics. The training program would be based on real-world special operations experience, drawing on actual mission scenarios to prepare soldiers for combat. It was exactly the kind of work Marcus had always wanted to do, helping prepare the next generation of warriors for the challenges they would face. The irony was perfect. Jake was going to pay him to use his own expertise, to train soldiers using knowledge and experience that Jake had been claiming as his own for years. Marcus would be doing the job that Jake had been pretending to do, while Jake took credit for the results. "This looks comprehensive," Marcus said. "Who else will be working on the program?" "We have a small team of former military personnel," Jake said. "Good people, but they don't have your level of experience. You'll be the senior instructor, the subject matter expert. The success of the program will depend largely on your input." "What about oversight? Who's our point of contact at the Pentagon?" Jake pulled out another file. "Colonel Patricia Martinez, Army Special Operations Command. She'll be evaluating our performance and making recommendations for future contracts. She's tough, very demanding but fair. She knew my brother, actually. She's mentioned him several times in our conversations. Marcus kept his expression neutral, but his heart was racing. Colonel Martinez had been his commanding officer on several missions, a brilliant strategist who'd always pushed her people to be better. She'd know immediately that Jake wasn't qualified for this work, that he lacked the experience and knowledge necessary to develop an effective training program. "When do I meet her?" Marcus asked. "Next week. She's coming to review our facilities and meet the team. I'll introduce you as our new senior instructor. She'll probably want to discuss your background in detail." This was getting complicated. Colonel Martinez would recognize Marcus immediately, would know that he was supposed to be dead. She'd also know that Jake was a fraud, that he'd been lying about his qualifications for years. The meeting could expose everything, or it could be the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth in a controlled environment. "I'll be ready," Marcus said. They spent the rest of the morning going over the details of the training program, reviewing the curriculum, discussing the facilities and equipment they'd need. Marcus was impressed despite himself by the quality of the proposal. Jake had clearly invested significant time and resources in developing a comprehensive program, even if he lacked the expertise to actually implement it. At noon, Jake suggested they take a break for lunch. "I want to introduce you to the team. Let everyone know you're on board." They walked through the office, and Marcus met the other employees of Sullivan Defense Solutions. There were about 30 people in the headquarters, a mix of former military personnel, civilian contractors, and administrative staff. Most of them were competent professionals who seemed genuinely committed to the company's mission. Marcus was introduced to the training team, 5 former military personnel who would be working on the Pentagon contract. They were all solid operators, men and women who'd served with distinction in various branches of the military. As they talked, Marcus could see that they respected Jake and believed in his leadership, but they also seemed hungry for the kind of expertise that Marcus could provide. "Mike's going to be leading the development of our new training program," Jake announced. "He's got 10 years of special operations experience, and he's exactly what we need to take this contract to the next level." The team welcomed Marcus warmly, and he spent the lunch hour answering questions about his background, sharing carefully edited stories about his military service. He could see the excitement in their eyes as they realized they'd be working with someone who had real combat experience, someone who could teach them things they'd never learned in traditional military training. After lunch, Jake gave Marcus a tour of the training facilities. The company had leased a large warehouse on the outskirts of town, converting it into a state-of-the-art tactical training center. There were shoot houses for urban warfare training, obstacle courses for physical conditioning, and classrooms for academic instruction. The quality of the facilities was impressive, clearly the result of significant investment and careful planning. "This is where you'll be spending most of your time," Jake said as they walked through the shoot house. "We want to create the most realistic training environment possible, something that will prepare soldiers for the challenges they'll face in combat." Marcus examined the facilities with a professional eye, nodding the attention to detail, the quality of the equipment, the thoughtful design of the training scenarios. Someone had put real expertise into creating this environment, someone who understood the complexities of modern warfare. Jake smiled with pride. "I did, actually. It took me 3 years to get it right, but I drew on everything my brother taught me about combat operations." He used to describe the missions in detail, and I tried to recreate the environments he faced. Marcus nodded, but something didn't add up. The facility was too sophisticated, too professionally designed for someone with Jake's limited experience. Someone else had been involved in the planning, someone with real expertise in special operations training. "Did you have any consultants help with the design?" Marcus asked. Jake's expression flickered for just a moment. "We brought in a few experts to review the plans, make sure everything met safety standards, but the concept was all mine." They finished the tour and returned to the office. Marcus spent the afternoon reviewing training manuals, studying the curriculum Jake had developed for the Pentagon contract. Again, he was struck by the quality of the work. The training scenarios were realistic and challenging. The academic content was comprehensive, and the progression from basic to advanced skills was well thought out. But as he read through the materials, Marcus began to recognize something familiar. The training scenarios weren't just realistic. They were based on actual missions he'd participated in. The urban warfare simulation was a recreation of a compound in Fallujah that Echo Team had assaulted in 2014. The hostage rescue scenario was based on a mission Marcus had led in Afghanistan. The sniper training program incorporated techniques he'd developed through years of combat experience. Someone had taken Marcus's actual mission reports and turned them into training scenarios. Someone with access to classified military records had studied his methods and tactics, then used them to create this program. The question was who, and how they'd gotten access to information that should have been restricted. At 5 o'clock, Marcus prepared to leave for the day. Jake appeared at his desk with a satisfied smile. "How was your first day?" "Informative," Marcus said carefully. "The training program is impressive, very detailed, very realistic." "That's what we're aiming for," Jake said. "Realism based on actual combat experience. My brother's experience, filtered through my understanding of what soldiers need to know." Marcus gathered his things and headed for the door. "I'll see you tomorrow. I want to start working on some refinements to the program." Excellent. I knew you were the right man for this job. As Marcus drove back to his hotel, he tried to process what he'd learned. Jake had built a legitimate business, had created quality training programs, had earned the respect of his employees. But it was all based on stolen expertise, on missions Marcus had fought and tactics he'd developed. The foundation was solid, but it was built on lies. More troubling was the question of how Jake had gained access to classified mission reports. Marcus's service record was classified. His mission reports were restricted, and his tactical innovations were proprietary military information. Someone in the Pentagon had been feeding Jake information, someone with high-level security clearance and access to special operations records. That evening, Marcus called Tom Morrison from his hotel room. The old rancher answered on the first ring. "How's the homecoming going, son?" "It's complicated," Marcus said. "Jake has built something real, something valuable, but it's all based on stolen information on my missions and my methods. I'm not sure how to proceed." "What does your gut tell you?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "That he's not doing this alone. Someone else is involved, someone with access to classified information. Jake doesn't have the connections or the clearance to get the kind of detailed mission reports he's been using." "Then maybe that's where you start," Tom suggested. "Find out who's been helping him, and you'll understand the full scope of what you're dealing with." "That's what I'm thinking. But Tom, there's something else. The people who work for him, they're good people. They believe in what they're doing and they're providing valuable services to the military. If I expose Jake, I destroy their livelihoods too." "Justice isn't always clean, Marcus. Sometimes innocent people get hurt when the truth comes out, but that doesn't mean the truth should stay hidden." After hanging up, Marcus spent the evening researching Jake's military connections. He used his knowledge of Pentagon bureaucracy and his understanding of the defense contracting process to identify potential sources for the classified information Jake had been using. The list was short but troubling. Only a handful of people would have had access to Marcus's complete service record, and even fewer would have had the detailed mission reports that Jake had been using for his training programs. Most of them were senior officers, people with decades of experience and impeccable reputations. One name kept appearing in Marcus's research: Colonel Patricia Martinez, the same officer who would be evaluating Jake's performance on the Pentagon contract. She'd been Marcus's commanding officer on several missions. She had access to his complete service record, and she'd been instrumental in developing the Army's special operations training protocols. The possibility that Colonel Martinez was involved in Jake's deception was almost too painful to consider. She'd been a mentor to Marcus, had recommended him for his final promotion, had written the letter of condolence to his family after his presumed death. If she was complicit in Jake's fraud, then the betrayal went far deeper than Marcus had imagined. But there was another possibility, one that made more sense given what Marcus knew about Colonel Martinez's character. She might not be helping Jake deliberately. She might be investigating him, gathering evidence of his deception while appearing to support his business. The meeting next week might not be a routine contract review. It might be a trap. Marcus fell asleep that night with more questions than answers. Tomorrow he would continue his reconnaissance, would dig deeper into Jake's operations and connections. He would also begin preparing for the meeting with Colonel Martinez, the woman who might be either his brother's accomplice or his own unexpected ally. The next morning brought a breakthrough. Marcus arrived at the office early, before most of the staff, and used his security badge to access areas he hadn't seen during his official tour. In a storage room on the second floor, he found filing cabinets full of documents that Jake probably didn't want most employees to see. The files contained copies of classified military reports, detailed mission summaries, and tactical analyses from special operations units across the Army. Marcus recognized many of the documents. They were reports he'd written, debriefings he'd participated in, and tactical innovations he'd developed during his years of service. But there were also documents from other units, other operators, other classified programs. Someone had been systematically collecting special operations intelligence and providing it to Jake for use in his training programs. The scope of the operation was far larger than Marcus had realized. At the bottom of one file, Marcus found a series of emails between Jake and someone, identified only as Patriot. The emails discussed the delivery of classified documents, the development of training scenarios, and the cultivation of military contacts who could provide ongoing intelligence. One email was particularly revealing. The Martinez meeting is crucial. She's been asking questions about your background, and we need to convince her that you're legitimate. Use the Sullivan materials to establish your credibility and make sure Stevens is ready to back up your story. Marcus photographed the email with his phone, then carefully returned the files to their original positions. He now had evidence that Jake was working with someone inside the military, someone with access to classified information and the ability to influence contract awards. More importantly, he had confirmation that Colonel Martinez was suspicious of Jake's qualifications. The meeting next week wasn't routine. It was an investigation disguised as a contract review. As Marcus returned to his desk, he found Jake waiting for him with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. "You're here early," Jake said. "Everything okay?" "Couldn't sleep," Marcus replied. I was thinking about the training program, about ways to improve the realism of the scenarios. Jake relaxed slightly. That's what I like to hear. What did you have in mind? Marcus spent the next hour discussing genuine improvements to the training program, suggestions based on his actual combat experience. As he talked, he watched Jake's face, looking for signs of recognition, for any indication that his brother suspected who he really was. But Jake seemed genuinely interested in the suggestions, taking notes and asking intelligent questions. Whatever else he was, Jake had become a skilled businessman, someone who could recognize valuable expertise when he saw it. "These are excellent ideas," Jake said finally. "I want you to incorporate them into the program before Martinez arrives. She's going to be impressed by the level of detail and realism." "When exactly is she coming?" Marcus asked. "Friday morning. She'll tour the facilities, meet the team, and review our training materials. It's our chance to show her that Sullivan Defense Solutions is the right contractor for this job." Marcus nodded, but his mind was racing. He had 4 days to prepare for a meeting that could change everything. 4 days to decide whether to reveal his identity to Colonel Martinez, whether to expose Jake's deception, whether to risk destroying the lives of 30 innocent employees. The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation. Marcus worked closely with the training team, incorporating his suggestions into the program and preparing for the colonel's visit. He also continued his investigation, gathering more evidence of Jake's deception and the involvement of the mysterious Patriot. By Thursday evening, Marcus had assembled a comprehensive dossier on Jake's operations. He had copies of the classified documents, photographs of the stolen mission reports, and screenshots of the emails with Patriot. He also had a detailed analysis of the training programs, showing how they were based on his actual combat experience rather than Jake's fictional background. The question now was what to do with the evidence. He could expose Jake immediately, could call the FBI and have his brother arrested for espionage and fraud. But that would destroy Sullivan Defense Solutions, would cost 30 people their jobs, and would end a training program that could save soldiers' lives. Alternatively, he could reveal his identity to Colonel Martinez and let her handle the situation through official channels. That would give him some control over the outcome, but it would also mean trusting his fate to a system that had already failed him once. Or he could continue the charade, could work within Jake's organization to gradually expose the truth while protecting the innocent employees and the valuable training program. It would be a long, complex process, but it might be the only way to achieve justice without destroying everything Jake had built. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with a forecast of rain that seemed appropriate for a day that would change everything. Marcus arrived at the office early, dressed in his best suit, carrying a briefcase full of evidence that could destroy his brother's life. At 9 o'clock, a black SUV pulled up outside the building. Colonel Patricia Martinez stepped out, followed by two junior officers and a civilian who was probably from the Pentagon's contracting office. Marcus watched from his office window as they approached the building, noting the colonel's confident stride, her sharp eyes, the way she carried herself with the authority of someone who'd spent decades in command. Jake appeared at Marcus's door, straightening his tie and checking his appearance in the reflection of the window. "Showtime," he said. "Remember, you're our secret weapon. She needs to see that we have the expertise to deliver on this contract." Marcus followed Jake downstairs to the lobby, where Jennifer, the receptionist, was waiting with visitors' badges. Colonel Martinez was smaller than Marcus remembered, but her presence filled the room. She was in her 50s now, with gray hair and laugh lines around her eyes, but she still radiated the competence and authority that had made her one of the Army's most respected officers. "Colonel Martinez," Jake said, extending his hand. "Welcome to Sullivan Defense Solutions. I'm Jake Sullivan, and I'm honored to have you here." The colonel shook Jake's hand with a firm grip, her eyes studying his face with the intensity of someone who missed nothing. "Mr. Sullivan, thank you for hosting us today. I'm looking forward to seeing what you've built here." Jake introduced the rest of the team, and when he came to Marcus, he placed a hand on his shoulder with genuine pride. "And this is Mike Stevens, our senior instructor and the man who's going to make this training program the best in the military." Colonel Martinez looked at Marcus directly, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Her eyes widened slightly, and Marcus could see the recognition dawning in her expression. She knew exactly who he was, but she kept her composure, extending her hand with professional courtesy. "Mr. Stevens," she said, her voice steady, "I look forward to discussing your background." Marcus shook her hand, feeling the slight tremor that betrayed her shock. "The pleasure is mine, Colonel. I've heard a great deal about your work." Jake led the group on a tour of the facilities, proudly showing off the training center, the classroom, and the tactical equipment. Marcus walked beside Colonel Martinez, answering her questions about the program while both of them carefully avoided acknowledging the elephant in the room. As they toured the shoot house, the colonel asked detailed questions about the training scenarios, the tactical procedures, and the learning objectives. Marcus answered with the expertise of someone who'd actually fought in similar environments, and he could see the approval in her eyes. "This scenario is based on urban combat operations in Iraq," Marcus explained as they walked through a mock compound. The layout replicates the kind of structures our soldiers encounter in real combat situations. It's very realistic, Colonel Martinez said, almost like it was designed by someone who'd actually fought in these environments. Jake stepped forward with a proud smile. That's exactly right. The scenarios are based on detailed briefings from actual combat veterans, including my late brother. We've tried to capture the reality of modern warfare in our training. Colonel Martinez nodded, but Marcus could see the skepticism in her expression. She knew that Jake had never seen combat, had never been in a position to develop this kind of expertise. The question was what she planned to do about it. They finished the tour and returned to the conference room, where Jake had prepared a detailed presentation about the training program. He spoke confidently about the curriculum, the methodology, and the expected outcomes. But Marcus could see that Colonel Martinez was more interested in watching him than in listening to the presentation. "Mr. Stevens," she said during a break in Jake's presentation, "I'd like to hear your thoughts on the program. How do you plan to ensure that our soldiers receive the most realistic training possible?" Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that his answer would be crucial. "Colonel, I believe the key is authenticity. Soldiers need to train in conditions that replicate the chaos, the stress, and the complexity of real combat. They need to understand not just the tactics, but the emotional and psychological challenges they'll face. And you have experience with these challenges." "Yes, ma'am, 10 years of it." Colonel Martinez leaned forward slightly. "Can you be more specific about your background? I like to know who I'm working with." This was the moment Marcus had been preparing for. He could reveal his identity here, in front of Jake and the Pentagon representatives, and watch his brother's world collapse in real time. Or he could continue the charade, could protect Jake while working within the system to expose the truth gradually. "I spent most of my career in special operations," Marcus said carefully. "Afghanistan, Iraq, various classified operations. I've seen what happens when soldiers aren't properly prepared for combat, and I've seen what happens when they are. This program has the potential to save lives, and I'm committed to making it as effective as possible." Colonel Martinez studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Stevens. It's clear that you have the expertise we need for this program." The meeting continued for another hour, with discussions about timelines, deliverables, and performance metrics. Colonel Martinez asked pointed questions about Jake's qualifications, about the source of the training materials, and about the company's track record. Jake answered confidently, but Marcus could see sweat beading on his forehead. Finally, Colonel Martinez stood and gathered her papers. "Thank you for your time today. We'll be in touch within the next week with our decision." As the Pentagon delegation prepared to leave, Colonel Martinez approached Marcus privately. "Mr. Stevens, I wonder if you'd be available for a follow-up conversation. I have some additional questions about the training program." "Of course, Colonel. When would be convenient?" She handed him a business card. "Call me this afternoon. I think we have a lot to discuss." After the Pentagon delegation left, Jake was euphoric. He gathered the team in the conference room and praised everyone's performance, particularly Marcus's contributions to the presentation. "I think we nailed it," Jake said. "Martinez was impressed, and Stevens here was the star of the show. I have a good feeling about this contract." Marcus smiled and accepted the congratulations of his colleagues, but his mind was elsewhere. Colonel Martinez knew who he was, and she wanted to talk privately. The conversation that afternoon would determine the course of everything that followed. At 3 o'clock, Marcus called the number on Colonel Martinez's card. She answered on the first ring. "Colonel Martinez." "Colonel, this is Mike Stevens. You asked me to call." "Yes, Mr. Stevens. Or should I say, Sergeant Major Sullivan." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. "Hello, Colonel. It's good to hear your voice." "Marcus, what the hell is going on? You're supposed to be dead. I wrote a letter to your family, attended your memorial service. How are you here, and why are you working for your brother?" Marcus took a deep breath and began to tell his story. He explained his captivity, his injuries, his long recovery, and his decision to stay dead rather than disrupt the lives that had been built on his grave. He told her about discovering Jake's deception, about the stolen military records, about the training programs based on his actual combat experience. Colonel Martinez listened in silence, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just absorbing the incredible story. When Marcus finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "My God, Marcus, I don't know whether to court-martial you for being AWOL or recommend you for another medal for surviving what you've been through." "I'm not AWOL, Colonel. I was a prisoner of war, then a patient, then a civilian trying to rebuild his life. I never deserted." "I know that. But the situation is incredibly complex. Your brother has been defrauding the government, using classified information to build his business. That's a serious crime. But he's also created a valuable training program that could save soldiers' lives." "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to help me build a case against the people who have been feeding him classified information. Your brother is a small fish, Marcus. Someone in the Pentagon has been systematically compromising special operations intelligence, and we need to find out who." Marcus felt a surge of hope. Colonel Martinez wasn't just interested in punishing Jake. She was interested in justice, in uncovering the full scope of the conspiracy. I've been gathering evidence, Marcus said. I have copies of classified documents, emails with someone called Patriot, and detailed analysis of how Jake's been using stolen information. Good. I want you to continue working undercover, but now you'll be working for me. We're going to find out who Patriot is, and we're going to shut down this operation. But Marcus, there's something else you need to know. What? I've been investigating Jake for months. I knew something was wrong with his background, but I couldn't prove it. When I saw you today, everything clicked into place. Your brother isn't just a fraud, he's a security risk. And whoever's been helping him is a traitor. Marcus felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about reclaiming his identity or exposing his brother's lies. This was about national security, about protecting the classified information that kept soldiers alive. "What's the plan?" he asked. "Keep working at Sullivan Defense Solutions, but now you're working for Army Intelligence. Document everything, gather evidence, and help us identify Patriot. When we have enough evidence, we'll make our move." And Jake will face justice. But first, we need to make sure we get everyone involved in this conspiracy. Can you do this, Marcus? Can you work with the man who stole your life in order to protect national security? Marcus thought about Tom Morrison's words about justice versus revenge, about the difference between getting even and setting things right. He thought about the soldiers who would benefit from the training program, about the classified information that needed to be protected, about the duty he'd sworn to uphold when he'd first put on the uniform. "Yes, Colonel, I can do this." "Good. Welcome back to the war, Sergeant Major. This time we're fighting on the home front." That evening, Marcus returned to his hotel room with a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just a dead man seeking to reclaim his life. He was an undercover operative working to protect national security. The mission was complex, dangerous, and personal, but it was also necessary. He spread out his evidence on the desk and began preparing for the next phase of the operation. Colonel Martinez had given him new objectives, new methods, and new resources. He would continue working for Jake, but now he would be gathering intelligence for the Army, building a case against the traitors who had compromised Special Operations security. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Jake calling from the office. "Mike, great news. Martinez just called. We got the contract. $12 million over 3 years, and it's all thanks to your presentation today." Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the training program would continue, satisfaction that soldiers would benefit from his expertise, and guilt that Jake was celebrating a victory built on stolen valor. "That's wonderful news," Marcus said. "When do we start?" "Monday morning. We'll need to move fast to meet the timeline, but I have confidence in our team. Mike, I want you to know that I consider you a partner in this business. You've brought something to Sullivan Defense Solutions that we've never had before. What's that? Credibility, expertise, the real thing. With you on board, there's no limit to what we can achieve. Marcus closed his eyes, thinking about the irony of his brother's words. Jake was right. Marcus had brought the real thing to Sullivan Defense Solutions. But Jake still didn't know that the real thing was standing right in front of him, wearing the face of a dead man. "I'm looking forward to getting started," Marcus said. "We're going to build something special together." After hanging up, Marcus sat in his hotel room and thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 10 years ago, he'd been a soldier fighting enemies in foreign lands. Now, he was a soldier fighting enemies at home, working to protect the country he'd served from threats within its own borders. The mission was just beginning, but Marcus Sullivan was ready for the fight. He'd been dead for 10 years, but he was alive now, and he had work to do. The shot he'd been preparing to take was more complex than he'd imagined, but it was also more important. Justice would be served, but it would take time, patience, and the same skills that had made him one of the Army's best snipers. He would wait for the perfect moment, gather all the intelligence he needed, and then take the shot that would change everything.